In a plain with nothing but bushes, Kim Seho, or rather, Lloyd Frontera, observes with his pets and his loyal servant a vast sea of money. Digging his shovel into the ground, Lloyd activates his ability, turning that vast plain into a cluster of future buildings. This is the story of a civil engineer who completely changed the medieval world. But before that, let's go back a few years. You have been randomly chosen by the Absolute Being as a candidate. From now on, you will be a character in the novel, Knights of Blood and Iron. This was the message Kim Seho received as soon as he opened his eyes. Instantly, he realizes he has ended up in the fantasy world of the novel he read the night before but is confused because he woke up on the ground. He gets up, freezing, his mouth paralyzed from sleeping on the road. The system mocks him, leaving him stressed and making Lloyd try to hit it. Regaining consciousness, he knows he has possessed someone from the novel, but the only person who sleeps on the street and lives in the rural area is the young Master Lloyd. His bodyguard, who is searching everywhere, finally finds him. He is none other than the protagonist of the novel, Javier Azrahan. The protagonist recognizes him immediately, as he looks exactly like the illustrations in the novel. In the novel, Javier's reputation as a swordsman spread throughout the continent, but initially, he is just an anonymous knight who works in the countryside. When the protagonist finds out he is the vagabond Lloyd, he becomes extremely irritated. Seeing this, Javier says he never called him a vagabond, but is glad he has self-awareness. Back at his family's mansion, Javier is warming the fireplace, asking if Lloyd really can't remember what happened. Apparently, he drank until he was completely drunk, destroyed the bar, managed to get back home on pure instinct, but ended up fainting on the way. The protagonist, freezing, observes the ground. Although it's warm, the environment is still very cold, as expected in a fantasy medieval world. Before leaving, Javier says he will report the bar incident to Lloyd's father and is questioned by the protagonist about his family's debts. He knows the whole story from the novel, having read it in one night in his apartment. He also knows Lloyd's family's fate. The Baron and Baroness were killed by scammers, and vagabond Lloyd died vomiting blood. The protagonist is furious at how Lloyd has been living until now. It's even worse than his past life in Korea. The next day, his mother asks if he really destroyed things at the bar last night, and asks him to apologize to the owner this time. The protagonist thinks the body owner should apologize since he didn't do anything, but still says he will apologize. His words truly scare them both. They never imagined he would apologize to anyone. In the city, a man working with Hay sees Lloyd and his guard walking through town, so scared of him that he hides behind the cart. In fact, this happens to everyone in town. Even children are instructed not to make eye contact with him. His mere presence disgusts the villagers, but this is something he already knows. He wonders why Javier is following him. Javier says the Lord asked him to prevent any accidents from happening again. In short, he's there to protect the villagers from Lloyd. The protagonist wonders if he should try to clean up his image first, but the more urgent matter is to make a lot of money to settle the family's debts so he can enjoy a good life. He checks the system for any hacks he can use, but only finds 2 useless abilities. Javier asks where Lloyd is going since they are already in front of the bar. The protagonist says he got distracted and didn't realize they had arrived, but Javier is still very suspicious of his actions and suspects he is lying. As the protagonist enters the bar, Javier thinks he's different from the night before, as if he's become someone else. Inside the bar, we see that Lloyd indeed caused a mess the night before. He apologizes, but it only puts the bar owner on high alert. Seeing that the bar owner is scared because he's speaking formally, he tries to be a bit more arrogant, but it seems his apology didn't work very well. Outside, Javier says it's normal for the bar owner not to accept his apologies, since he destroyed all his furniture and decorations that took so long to acquire. He says the bar owner will only be satisfied after receiving compensation, but the protagonist has several family debts to settle. Javier continues, saying the bar owner's mother's condition has worsened due to the winter cold, but this gives the protagonist a brilliant idea. As if a light bulb had finally lit up in his head, he remembers that there's no concept of heated stone slab floors here. If he could make one in this world, it would definitely sell well. This is something Lloyd could never do, but with Kim Seho's knowledge, it would be possible. In Korea, he studied civil engineering and even managed to build a house while in the army. Excited about the new idea, he tells Javier he'll go back to the bar, but as he's returning, he receives a notification from the system saying his real journey has begun, and now he had RP points to earn from people. At first, he doesn't quite understand what it means and imagines it must be similar to XP. However, unlike XP, he doesn't gain it by killing monsters but by improving his relationship with characters, so he takes the opportunity to test how it works on Javier. His impression level with him is at -30, finding this number very low. He tries to compliment him by saying he's handsome, but this only makes the impression even more unfavorable, now at -31. He decides to set this aside for now to avoid irritating him and proceeds to the bar. At the bar, Lloyd is trying to make a contract with the owner. The contract states that he will build something to pay for the cost of all the items he broke. The owner obviously becomes wary and suspicious of his actions, even using a mental barrier ability against the protagonist. Since his reputation is completely destroyed, he can't simply try to transform into someone else to redeem himself. Instead, he uses his reputation as a vagabond to make the bar owner sign the contract. Now with the contract in hand, Lloyd says it was an excellent choice to negotiate with him, while his bodyguard looks at him with suspicion of his actions. Outside in the bar's yard, he's measuring the site with a shovel. Javier asks if he's trying to establish a new pattern of misconduct, since he threatened the bar owner to sign the contract. The protagonist says he's judging him based on what he did in the past, but now things are different. He will make them smile in the end. He starts digging and thinks that the reason for their smiles will be the foundation of his future money. He begins digging a hole and flattening it, hitting it several times to make it smooth. Then he constructs the house structure using wood from the mansion's warehouse. A week later, the foundation of the house is almost ready. He just has to use the red clay by the river to create the exterior. However, he's not an inexhaustible machine. His body is still physically weak. Javier is truly impressed that he is keeping his part of the contract with the bar owner. Even though he's exhausted, the protagonist says he has no time to rest and continues his work. He prepares to cut the wood but is stopped by Javier, who takes the axe from his hand and asks what needs to be done. He tosses the wooden planks into the air and quickly cuts them into perfect shapes. The protagonist is impressed, giving him a thumbs up. This is expected from someone about to become a sword master, and he compares it to modern equipment. He boldly asks Javier to help him dig, which obviously annoys him since instead of thanking him, he's asking him to work more. But the protagonist convinces him, saying that if they finish quickly, he'll be able to satisfy his curiosity about what he's doing. With no other choice but to help him finish faster, Javier starts working with the protagonist, and shortly after, they complete the house. He questions him about the symbol on the plaque, but the protagonist says it's his logo. Then he calls him to check what kind of problem he caused, lighting the fireplace and calling the bar owner and his mother. Both seem to love the warm room. The old woman says she feels like her joints are loosening, while the bar owner wonders how he did it. The protagonist thinks it's normal for people in this world to be surprised by this. It's the power of the Andal floor technique, a Korean method for heating rooms. Javier is impressed, seeing that he really managed to make the two smile. Even though he still doubts Lloyd's intentions, it's undeniable that because of him, two people are happy. Javier's impressions of the protagonist increased by 2 points, earning him 36 RP points. The protagonist even jokes a bit with his bodyguard, saying he was probably thinking, how could trash like this think of that? Even though he spent a bit to build this house, it doesn't matter, as this model house will be the showcase of his new money source. A few days later, people were lining up to experience the sauna. Those coming out all sweaty only made those who hadn't entered yet more curious about it. The protagonist takes this opportunity to try to sell his idea. He created 2 different plans, Type A, which is a separate construction, and Type B, which remodels the existing house floor, also offering a 10% discount if they buy both constructions. While the protagonist is using his cunning to sell the contracts, his father appears, asking what he's doing. The protagonist becomes apprehensive when he sees him, and already in the mansion, they are having dinner facing each other at the table. It's not like he's avoiding him, but it would be problematic if he forbade him from working on the constructions. His father decides to listen to what he has to say and asks what he is plotting this time. He tries to act as Lloyd would and says that the only thing he did was build a heated room for the bar owner, although his father already knows about the contract he made with him and warns that lying and deceiving the population will not be tolerated. The The protagonist says that's not what he's doing and asks to leave, but his father asks if he's worried about the family's situation. He continues to say not to worry, that he will overcome this situation immediately, and asks him not to stray from the right path. The protagonist remembers that in his past life, he also heard these words from his father. At the time, he thought everything was fine, but it was all a lie. As he leaves, he tells his father not to give up and to keep going strong. Those were the words he should have said to his father back then. While walking through the corridors thinking about the requests he received, 2 loan sharks pass by him without even greeting him. In the Baron's room, they say he has 5 days until the deadline, and if he continues not paying, they won't stand still. The protagonist, who was eavesdropping behind the door, thinks this is the perfect time to appear. He remembers receiving some RP when Javier's impression increased and found out he could use them to level up his skills. A sensor scans him completely, analyzing all the skills he possesses. The system says he's smarter than he seems, and the protagonist, angry, says it's obvious since he was a high-achieving scholarship student. The 2 skills he acquired based on his current knowledge were basic measurement and basic design. Even though he doesn't quite know what they mean, he buys both. Basic measurement is activated, and his eyes begin to glow green. As soon as he looks outside, he can calculate the land area simply with his eyes. The design skill creates a screen in front of him capable of drawing models quickly, much more useful than doing it on paper, for example. Even though the work will definitely become easier from now on, there's still a construction problem since he doesn't have enough manpower, and he thinks that having a backhoe or heavy machine would make things much easier. The system says it's possible to summon one, making the protagonist quite excited, but it costs 50 RP to summon a random fantasy species, and he only has one. Still, that's great since if fantasy species are as he imagines, they will probably be more useful than heavy machines. Back to the loan sharks. They are threatening the Baron that if he doesn't have enough money to pay, they might end up taking his wife and maid to be sold. However, at that moment, the protagonist arrives, asking if they have no manners just because they are loan sharks. They ask why a child is interfering in adult conversations, but before they ask him to leave, the protagonist asks for their invitation letter. In the kingdom's noble law, in Article 3, Section 6, it says that all nobles have the right to protect their rights and interests, and entering a noble's mansion without an invitation is equivalent to invasion. The loan sharks say they've never heard of this law, but he tells them to check it together and calls Javier. As soon as he enters the room, the protagonist orders to cut off the invader's arms. The loan sharks ask if he's crazy and if he plans to resolve this in court. Then he says that's why he told them to check together. He wants to see which side the court will take. Seeing Javier unsheath his sword, the 2 loan sharks get scared and flee, saying they will regret this. His father questions him scared, saying this won't help calm the situation, until Lloyd throws a bag of money on his table. He says that's the initial payment he received and that it's a considerable amount for this month. His father thinks he's extorting money from people, but Javier tells him not to worry since he's monitoring the young master to keep his promise. Seeing that Javier trusts his son, he allows himself to trust him this time. In the corridors, Javier asks how he knows about the law, as he always thought he was an ignorant person, but the protagonist, angry, replies that he found it around. In fact, he found it in the novel. After the couple's death, the loan sharks wanted to dig and take the bodies to sell. At that moment, Javier talks about the law and cuts off the heads of the 2, knowing the novel's content is beneficial, but in any case, one message catches his attention now. He gains 60 RP as his father's trust increased. He goes to a secluded area away from people and activates the random spin. Several gears start floating in the air, forming a magic circle, but it's smaller than he imagined. From this circle, a small mouse comes out, falling to the ground. Seeing that tiny mouse, the protagonist thinks his summoning was a failure, making the poor mouse cry. It manages to communicate, saying that it's not a failure and can do many things. The protagonist asks what it can do, so it spits out a manual. Despite finding it grosses, the protagonist takes the drool-covered manual and discovers that besides being cute, they can have their constitution altered by feeding them sunflower seeds. Red seeds make them giant for 12 hours, while blue ones make them small. He asks if it can become as big as a human, since hamsters are good diggers. If it were human-sized, it would be really useful. When he feeds it, the hamster starts glowing and growing. It grows so much, and so quickly that it ends up colliding with the protagonist, throwing him a bit away. The hamster, which could fit in his palm before, must now be over 10 meters tall. Besides, it has the digging ability, able to quickly dig through the ground. It can also harden the ground by rolling over it, and can store plenty of things in its mouth. The protagonist is happy because the heavy machinery problem is solved, but he can't just show up with these giant creatures since people might get suspicious. So, he will carry a book with him all the time and claim to be a summoning genius. The next day, Lloyd is instructing the workers with his slogans. He makes everyone repeat with him, "Safety first." The army of 30 people is clearly demotivated for work, even though they are still paid even if they don't work. The protagonist wonders why the Baron didn't fire them before, but this works better for him since there won't be additional labor costs. To try to motivate them, the protagonist gives a motivational speech, pointing at a handful of dirt, saying he spent the night digging it up, and they should take it to the constructions. In reality, it was Podong who did it in 30 minutes. But even with a speech, they are still not motivated at all. He even thinks it's a normal reaction since people don't like to work. Then he is interrupted by the senior knight Nauman, who asks what he just ordered his troops to do. This man appearing there was something he expected. There are 3 knights living on this property, Newman, Bayern, and Javier. In the beginning of the novel, Bayern and Javier remained loyal until the property collapsed. But this man in front of him was the first to betray the Baron. Lloyd asks what he's doing, and he says he can't believe he's giving his soldiers dirty work, and as the head of the knights, he can't accept that. The protagonist says he got approval from the Lord, but he insists on talking about the past and that the protagonist must be using the soldiers for personal purposes. Lloyd asks if he wants a beating, and just with that, the guy gets quite stressed. He then makes the first move by throwing sand in his face. Everyone who sees that is shocked, while the guard asks if he really just tried to tarnish his reputation as a knight. The protagonist pretends he didn't hear what he said, then challenges him to a duel right away. Returning to the mansion, Javier asks if he has confidence in defeating Newman. His opponent has a mana heart, and is also known as a sword specialist, while the protagonist is just a wretch. How could he even think of winning against him? Javier gets irritated with Lloyd teasing him, almost cutting him with his sword. He tries to analyze his actions, but everything he is doing is very strange. After picking his nose, he asks Javier to teach him swordsmanship. Javier says he would never teach his swordsmanship to someone like him, as someone with bad character like him could use it against people around him. The protagonist knew he wouldn't teach his swordsmanship right away, so he proposes to cure his insomnia. Javier wonders how he knows that, as if he's answering him in his head. The protagonist says he read it in the novel. In the novel, the ranking of the knights is divided into 4 levels. Javier's level is expert swordsman, and he will soon rise to the highest level, master swordsman. And the reason he can't sleep is that his nerves are superhuman. He agrees to the contract with Lloyd, but he will only teach swordsmanship if he can make him sleep, and says that he has already tried several ways to cure his insomnia, from cognitive behavioral therapy, herbal remedies, aromatic therapy. Even after saying all that, in a few minutes, he was already sleeping like a baby, hugging his pillow. The method the protagonist used to make him sleep is the same as teachers do in the classroom. He talked so much that at some point he just fell asleep. Now that he has fulfilled his part of the deal, all his sword techniques will be his. The next day, Javier, now refreshed from having a good night's sleep, tells the protagonist to start training with 50 laps. And surprisingly, he starts running without complaining. He completes 1 lap and says he hates doing it, but by the 2nd lap, he totally changes and says he surely didn't expect him to do it without complaining. By the 3rd lap, he unmasks his plan, saying he would say something like, "You don't have talent for this," and ignore the training. While he's being totally annoying to Javier, he gains a skill that asks him to hit himself, but he tells the system to discard it. It would be a lie to say he's not tired, but this is nothing compared to his past life. He had no family and woke up alone every day. At work, he carried bricks up to the 4th floor of a building every day, and at night, he unloaded trucks. All this just to survive, hoping that one day it would get better. Compared to that pain and despair, this is nothing. Seeing that determination and sincerity, Javier decides to teach him his sword technique. In the mansion, Newman talks to the Baron. He is disappointed that his son dared to insult someone who has protected his family for so long. He had hoped that he was becoming more rational, but it seems he was mistaken. He says it's his duty not to cancel the duel but asks him not to hurt him so much since he's still the heir to the estate. Newman says he accepts his request, but his true intentions are entirely different. He plans to kill him in the fight, and if the Baron complains, he will kill him and his wife and make it look like suicide, all as he had planned. 1 month later, the long-awaited battle begins. The Baron and the Baroness, with their servants, watch anxiously. Newman asks if the protagonist is prepared. He, carrying only a shovel, says he should be prepared to take a beating. Everyone watching the fight from outside wonders if he's really going to fight with a shovel. Javier says he personally asked the blacksmith to forge it. His father is deeply disappointed, thinking he's playing around with a serious situation, but Javier, who has been following what he's been doing for the past month, doubts that he's just fooling around. Early in the morning, he did the basic training without complaining. Then he went to the construction area to teach the residents about Andal, and then practiced swordsmanship until falling asleep at night. Someone who dedicated himself so much for a month couldn't be just fooling around. Javier is sure he's taking the fight seriously. The Baron initiates the duel between them, and the protagonist starts the combat with a pretty mediocre stance. Newman, who was already pissed off with him, is the first to attack but has his first attack defended. Both his father and Javier are impressed that he managed to defend an attack, and it wasn't just luck, since he continues to defend all the subsequent attacks. Javier is impressed with the extraordinary efficiency of his movements. It's like a sword technique evolved over many years. In fact, it's called modern combat, bayonet charge, something every Korean man learns in the army. Even using the shovel as a weapon wasn't random, since in addition to being able to use the shovel to defend himself, he can also use it to attack. For this combat, the protagonist came 100% prepared, first preparing the shovel, second, the basic sword technique, and finally, a tool synchronization ability for excavation. He managed to buy this ability thanks to Javier and his parents. Then, Newman shows why he is a Baron's Knight. He starts accelerating the state of his own mana using his mana heart. He truly prepares to attack this time, advancing almost instantly towards the protagonist. Even Javier says it's impossible for an ordinary person to block an attack from someone who has a mana heart. That's if he were an ordinary person, of course. Even though he attacked with all his strength, aiming to kill, the protagonist manages to block the sword. Newman is confused, feeling as if his body had sunk. This was the fourth ability he prepared, Azrahan's core technique, the technique that made Javier the strongest man in the novel. He realizes that his attack's mana was absorbed, immediately pulling out his sword, but the protagonist takes advantage of this opening to land a blow on his face. The impact is so great that he sees one of his teeth flying, and then he is hit by another attack. Everyone around is shocked. Lloyd really managed to win. His father ends the duel, but this isn't enough to quench Lloyd's anger. He continues to beat him while he's on the ground. His father gets angry, telling him to stop trying to tarnish the knight's honor. As some of the soldiers try to stop him, saying that the duel is over, the other knight from the family remarks that he's out of control. Lloyd claims to have calmed down, and asks the soldiers to release him, only to hit him again immediately afterward. Javier, who is observing more closely, notices that he's hitting only in places that would cause almost no wounds, and the calm expression on his face indicates that he already knew this would happen. 15 days before the duel, the protagonist came asking him to teach the mental technique Azrahan. This startles Javier, since this technique was created by him, and supposedly no one else should know it. He confirms if this technique can attract mana from the surroundings and convert it into one's own. Javier asks how he knows the technique, but the protagonist shamelessly lies, saying he talked about it in his sleep. Javier says he can't teach the technique because it's still incomplete, but the protagonist claims he can complete it. He explains that if he absorbs external mana and puts it in the mana heart, the mana heart will simply reject it and explode it out, as they don't mix. He should concentrate it separately, and then move it around the mana heart. Javier thinks this might really be possible and asks how he came up with it, but the protagonist continues to brazenly say he just imagined it would work. That day, Javier was able to complete the technique he had been worrying about for so long, and on the first try, he managed to create 3 circles. Lloyd says he doesn't want to create a mana heart. All he wants to learn is the absorption part. He just wants to absorb what he can touch. Since he had learned this ability, Javier thought he could defeat Newman, but he triumphantly won. His father again tells him to stop talking about his reputation as a knight, but he tells him to look under the tablecloth and then say if this man deserves to be called a knight. He finds several letters, and when he reads their contents, everything is there. From the property's situation to the Baron's likes and dislikes and instructions on how to forge fake documents. These letters contain everything he has shared so far. Newman wonders how he found them since he had hidden them inside the wall, but due to the novel, he already knew where they were and sent his hamster to fetch them. He sees that his father is completely shocked. In the novel, he was described as a kind man, but this protagonist doesn't know the words kind and friendly. He suggests a way to get rid of this man. He proposes throwing fierce rats on his head and then banishing him from the properties or reducing him to a normal knight and giving him a chance to think about his sins. People are confused about why he wants to throw rats at him, since a measly rat wouldn't be able to hurt Newman. Both his father and the people around think it's a sensible and generous suggestion, albeit understandably dangerous. His father agrees to the punishment and asks if Newman has any objections to it. He obviously doesn't, and thanks for their mercy. If you treat an evildoer well, will they really reflect on their sins and return the given mercy? Or will they become even more determined to manipulate and figure out how to take advantage of that kindness? The protagonist says it's great to see his final smile, gives a red sunflower seed for his pet to eat, and says there's no best method to ask for forgiveness. The rat thrown into the air grows to a colossal size, falling on top of Newman, probably killing him. With this, the rotten apple of his lands has just fallen. The next day, his hamster digs a path in the middle of the city. Javier asks what he's doing, and Lloyd replies that he's preparing the way to build a road. The engineering unit, previously shy and unwilling to work, has now become surprisingly efficient. He mentions that in ancient times there was a city called Rome, where people loved roads and even created a road system called the Appian Way. He wants to build something similar, a road that stretches from the Baron's house to the eastern coast. Javier questions again why he's building a road, but the protagonist tells him to just watch quietly and see the rising popularity of roads. However, everything seems very strange to Javier, so he asks where he suddenly learned to do all this. He asks if he's really his young master Lloyd. When the protagonist saw this guy's personality in the novel, he knew something like this could happen. He's the kind of person who would notice the change and immediately draw his sword. He starts using his Lloyd persona, claiming he studied without anyone knowing, and when questioned, since he only lived on alcohol, he says that Javier didn't watch him all day and couldn't know if he was studying or not. He asks how he explains the summoning, as it would be difficult for mages even with 20 years of experience. So the protagonist retorts by asking how he manages to use mana so well at 20 years old, and says that if he's a genius, why couldn't he be one too? Unable to refute his words, Javier just stays silent, so the protagonist seizes the moment to flee and get out of there as fast as possible. He goes to Knight Bayer and asks him to take care of everything while he's away. Javier says he'll accompany him, as it's his duty to watch over the young master, but the protagonist questions why he's stating something so obvious. Javier asks where they are going, and he replies that they are going to a distant place to collect unpaid debts. In a small, remote town in the Runia property, the scammer from Thor to Real Estate is very stressed because he lost a lot of money. His bodyguard says it's normal since he makes money by gambling, and also says that if he doesn't have enough money to pay him, he'll have to leave. The scammer gets scared, saying he can still pay and that he shouldn't go anywhere. He can make money by cheating others again, but since many people are looking for him, it's better to lay low for now. At that moment, the protagonist kicks the bar door open. The man asks what's wrong with him, but when the protagonist introduces himself as Lloyd Frontera, the guy is shocked as if seeing a ghost. The scammer immediately tells his bodyguard to run with him, and with just one leap, he jumps through the bar window. However, when he reaches the alley, a man is already waiting for him. Javier orders him to surrender the scammer and leave. If he refuses, he will be considered an accomplice. The bodyguard won't give up so easily, and as he prepares a spell, he asks if he even knows how to use a sword. The protagonist, observing the fight through the broken window, says that when Javier lost the Baron, he sought revenge and then fought this bodyguard, the first evil black mage he encountered. He had to fight against gravity power, at least that's how it is in the novel. The black mage then uses his gravity magic, directing it towards Javier. He manages to defend using his sword, but the magic expands and creates a gravitational field around him. The black mage then activates the gravity, causing him to break the ground with his feet. When Javier fought this guy in the novel, he was just an expert swordsman, but now this Javier has 3 mana circles and easily manages to cut the gravity magic. Seeing that it will be impossible to confront him directly, the black mage flees, saying that wasn't part of the contract. Javier asks if he knows what happens if he strikes a noble, intending to cut his legs, so he will crawl to the tribunal. However, at the last second, the scammer is saved by Lloyd, who steps in the middle of the attack and prevents it from landing. He shouts at Javier, saying he will be punished with death if he goes to the tribunal. Javier is shocked. Lloyd just showed kindness to another person. They tie up and lock the swindler in the room. Seeing him quite apprehensive, the protagonist tells him not to be so afraid since he won't kill him. After all, if he did, the people he owes money to would cause a mess. The swindler asks if the protagonist will forgive him, and Lloyd replies that he won't take it to the tribunal, but he expects compensation in money. But since he doesn't have money to pay, the protagonist has another way to forgive him. All he has to do is sign this contract, and that's it. The swindler asks what kind of contract it is. It's just an ordinary worker's contract, and he will be paid, of course, but 80% of his salary will go to repayments due to the high debt, to be paid after 520 years. This shocks both the swindler and Javier. It was obvious that he wasn't there just to sympathize and forgive. The protagonist thinks he'd never be crazy enough to kill a guy who owes him. He'll suck every drop of money he can for the rest of his life. The swindler asks how he can make such an unfair contract, but when the protagonist threatens to take it to the tribunal, he ends up signing the contract right away. Back in the cart on the way to town, we see the swindler still tied up. Javier mentions that due to this guy's money, they won't have to worry about interest for a few months. However, the protagonist corrects him, saying he'll use all that money to invest in labor costs since the 30 soldiers aren't enough. A few days later, we see the protagonist recruiting employees. The line is so long that it extends for several meters. He asks Javier if these people really hate him. He's sure they do, but due to selling the Diendal for a lower price and being firm in punishing the traitor, people have started to see him as trustworthy and capable. The man in front of him asks where to sign the contract but thanks him first since his son used to get very cold in winter. But thanks to him, he doesn't have to worry about that this year. The protagonist even feels ashamed, as he's only satisfying his greed. The man continues, saying he has relatives from another town who would like to buy the Andals. The protagonist expected this to happen, since he didn't build the Andal for nothing. Now he'll raise the price under the pretext of travel expenses and make all the money from them. Up in the mountains, Lloyd tells Javier that one day this mountain will be entirely bare because the Andal consumes a lot of resources. The trees here won't last long. That's why he's canceling the construction of the Appian Way. At the end of the road, there's a reserve of bituminous coal. They'll extract and sell it for a high price. If the Andal gains a high level of approval, other countries won't be able to resist. Of course, the people in their town will get a discount, but just a little. Lloyd asks if he finds this unfair, but he says if he doesn't do it, he won't be able to pay off the family's debts. Javier agrees with this, but mining there is impossible as it already collapsed once. Still, he says he can do it because he knows modern-era excavation technology. He will use the shield method. Javier has no idea what this shield method means but says he'll continue to observe this completely different young master. However, even the protagonist who read the novel doesn't know everything. In this world, there are hidden dangers, and within the cave are thousands of creatures just waiting to emerge. Lloyd clasps his hands and performs magic, casting it upward and summoning a high-level apartment. A huge building appears from the sky, falling behind him. At least that's what he would like to do, but the only magic he uses is on his finger to design faster. Tired because this project is taking too long, he thinks he would like to summon 100 undead workers who don't need a salary. Due to the incident with Newman, he gains 639 reputation points due to favorable impressions from people. He upgraded his basic design skills and basic measurement skills to intermediate level, gaining new functions. Arriving at the mine entrance, he reflects on how he's supposed to dig there. He activates his intermediate measurement skill and can scan up to 5 meters. With this ability, he can find the safest path, but the problem is how to unearth the entrance quickly. Humans will take too long and get tired easily, and Padong is sick of the road project. He sees no other choice but to randomly draw a new species. He activates the mini portal again, which makes quite a noise, and a mini snake comes out of it. Seeing this cute snake, it seems apparently useless on the outside, but he remembers that was the case with Padong too, and asks if it grows big with sunflower seeds. He asks her to demonstrate her skills, and weeks later, he sees that she is much more useful than he imagined. She can eat the earth in front of the shield equipment, then she digests the food, and at that moment, Javier prepares for the attacks. She excretes steel, and Javier is in charge of cutting them, which are then used to build the terrain's support structure. Javier questions why he's cutting the poop of a giant snake, but the protagonist doesn't care and orders everyone to move forward, pushing the iron shield. Even though he installed oxygen tubes, he still feels a bit dizzy, but if it weren't for them, he would have probably passed out inside. Seeing that he's starting to get tired, Javier tells him that he also needs to rest with the other workers, but the protagonist says he's the site manager and needs to oversee the operation and act responsibly. In Korea, the people in charge of the work were the kind of people who didn't even show up on site. He hated those people and promises never to be like them. So, he uses his ability and detects luminous coal ahead. He cheers everyone up, saying they're almost there, and thanks to Little Snake because thanks to her, they were able to do this 10 times faster. While the protagonist explains that after they reach the coal, they'll have to dismantle the shields and expand the space, they start hearing a noise coming from the ground. Alarmed, the protagonist uses his ability and sees a small hole that wasn't there before, and this hole begins to grow larger until a giant ant emerges from it. Javier immediately cuts its antennae, and Lloyd uses his shovel to crush its head. The sudden appearance of this monster surprised him since it's something that didn't appear in the novel. But this is not the time to relax because an ant never walks alone. Thousands of ants begin to appear, and the protagonist evacuates everyone outside, while Javier manages to hold several of them, cutting them into pieces. If there's an ant colony, there can be from 200 to 1,000 monsters there. Javier is running out of breath. He won't be able to hold them all, and the path they made is so well structured that it won't collapse unless they use dynamite. The situation seems very complicated, so Javier slaps Lloyd's face to snap him out of it, and not panic, who is thinking incessantly for a solution, comes up with another brilliant idea. He tells Javier that they will attack head-on and enter the ant tunnel, even though he thinks it's absurd. There must be some reason behind it, so they proceed. At the mansion, the Baron receives the news that monsters have invaded the mine, and that his son and Javier stayed behind. He quickly puts on his armor set, and tells them to go immediately to the mine. Meanwhile, Javier continues fighting the ants and asks how much more they have to face. The two are completely surrounded by the ants. The protagonist knows that Javier is reaching his limit. He uses his ability to locate methane gas somewhere underground, knowing that if they can find it, they can create a large-scale explosion to deal with the ants. He manages to locate it, and starts digging to unearth the methane gas, with Javier protecting him. Things seem to be going well, but they both hear a very loud scream. The Ant Queen has decided to show up, and just by seeing her size, Javier says he can't face her. However, in this situation, he has no choice but to push beyond his limits, managing to defend against and counterattack the Queen's assault. While Javier fights her, the protagonist continues digging until he finally uncovers the gas. He tells Javier to get out of there as fast as possible and run to the entrance, while he grabs a still-burning torch. They run through the tunnel filled with dead ant bodies, and when they finally put enough distance, he throws the flaming torch towards the gas outlet. The Ant Queen tries to attack them but is hit by the massive explosion caused by the gas. Not only her, but all the ants in the cave are caught in the blast. Outside, people hear the noise and a great tremor from deep inside the cave. The Baron worries about his son and tries to enter the cave but is stopped by his bodyguard. Inside, the two survive the explosion, but Javier and the snake have fainted. To make matters worse, the entrance is blocked. Realizing they will soon run out of oxygen, the protagonist uses his ability to see through the wall. He sees no other option but to start digging. Javier, who managed to keep some consciousness, sees him working to get them out, and as a result, he builds a stronger bond with him. Seeing that he has nothing more to lose, he asks the system to enhance his abilities. The system reanalyzes the abilities he possesses, combining all these skills to create the core technique Azrahan. When the ability is created, he feels immense power coursing through his body. Even though he doesn't have a mana core, he can feel the mana circulating around his core. His mana increase went up to 120%, and now he has plenty of RP to spend, so he keeps increasing it until his technique reaches level 10. When it reaches level 10, it evolves, and he starts feeling 2 mana circles circulating around his heart. Now his mana increase is at 200%, and he also gains 2 new abilities, one that prevents fatigue for 10 minutes, and another that triples his mana for 20 minutes. He activates his fatigue-preventing ability and begins digging tirelessly towards the exit. After digging deep into the excavation, he finally sees a hole indicating the way out, but he is still 5 meters away. He doesn't give up and keeps digging until he reaches 3 meters away, but his oxygen runs out, and he falls to his knees, exhausted. Then he activates his other ability, Power Extension, and continues to hold on firmly to the excavation, but its limit is 20 seconds, which is not enough time for him to reach the exit. Already feeling hopeless, he thinks that as the son of a noble in a remote area, he just wanted to live a quiet life. Unfortunately, he is about to die after exerting so much effort. When he was about to accept his fate, Padong appears, making a small hole. This small hole is enough for him to breathe and regain his strength. Even though he is tired, he still gets up, clinging to the hope that a peaceful life as a noble awaits him just ahead. Inside the cave, the Baron's group explores it, even the deep parts, in search of the two, until he sees his son carrying Javier on his back, who surpassed the limits of his own body, was able to create a third ability that allowed him to endure until there. Seeing that he has finally achieved his goal, the protagonist faints, being embraced by his father. The next day, people in the city talk about what happened. Those who thought Lloyd was just a spoiled brat are impressed by his determination and courage to stay there, fighting against the ants and rescuing all the workers. Back in his room, Lloyd sleeps under Javier's watchful eye. As soon as he opens his eyes, the system's message saying that people are impressed with his courage and heroism appears in front of him. He quickly becomes a hero and gains 500 RP for it, which makes him very happy, of course. The next day, the workers are even more motivated in mining, and when they see Lloyd arriving, everyone starts greeting him and thanking him for saving them. They now see him as the person who saved their lives and think he's different from other nobles. 2 weeks have passed since the incident, and even though nothing has happened, the protagonist still decides to prioritize safety and conduct sweeps around the mine. Javier asks why he's personally doing these dangerous things when he could just send one of the workers. But the protagonist calls him an idiot. He should be responsible for the dangerous tasks, so they won't say anything even if he spends a lot of money. They reach the end of the tunnel, and Javier tells them to go back. But the protagonist seems to have seen something with his ability. He starts digging to investigate, as there might be ant eggs that haven't hatched yet. But what he finds is something unexpected. An orc trapped along with several other animals, probably stored to be eaten later. Javier says he looks dangerous and intends to take care of him right away, but he's stopped by the protagonist. Lloyd asks if he's dead, but Javier says ants have a habit of only paralyzing what they're going to eat. The MC gives a wicked smile, and says this is an incredible reward. Back at the mansion, the orc is already awake. His name is Hirosh, and he says he will never forget him as his savior. Hirosh, the son of the orc tribe leader, says he will do anything for Lloyd for being his savior. In fact, that was the exact reason he helped the Green One. Our prota asks for 120 orc workers to help at the mine, but his request is denied by the orc. As orcs are warriors, only other warriors can give them orders. And since young Lloyd is not a warrior, he couldn't give orders to the orcs even if they provided workers. In the orc tribe, it's necessary to bring the head of a monster ant when one becomes an adult. Hirosh made a mistake in the tunnel and ended up being paralyzed, but of course, our MC wouldn't let this opportunity pass so easily. Before anything else, he congratulates him for becoming an adult orc. Hirosh, crestfallen, says he couldn't catch a monster ant, so the protagonist says they caught the ant queen together, showing her head pinned to the wall. The Hulk says he doesn't remember catching such a big ant, but the liar says it was a truly surprising sight because when he entered the ant tunnel, the queen was trembling with fear. While Javier listens to his disgusting lie, The orc believes that they are both excellent warriors and that they together caught the queen. Lloyd mentions the 120 workers again, but this time the orc says he will recruit them. A week later, in the Steel Sand Tribe village, the protagonist, who had made a long trip there, finds out that the orc leader refuses his request. Shocked, he asks why. The orc chief says they need to hunt every day, and if they don't eat protein right after the hunt, they will lose muscle strength. Javier says these orcs are bodybuilding maniacs, so it will be impossible to convince them. The protagonist asks if there was a way to preserve the meat so they could go without hunting for more than 3 days, and he says he knows how to prevent the meat from spoiling even after several days. Let's go back a little in time to remember the moment they arrived in the village. The father and son, who hadn't seen each other for so many days, were extremely emotional to see each other again. They run to each other and give a tight hug. The impact of the hug alone was so strong that it caused a gust of wind to spread around. Lloyd says that if anyone had been between those two, they would have turned into mincemeat. Our mercenary thinks that if they can get 120 workers with these two, productivity will increase hundreds of times. But that wasn't the only thing that caught his attention. When Hirosh brought the Ant Queen's head as a celebration, the orcs were using massive gold objects for squats. Lloyd is shocked and wonders where they found those. It's as if they stole or took them from somewhere. Because of this, he makes a deal with the orc tribe leader to get both the labor force and the treasures. Javier is reading the contract and discovers that they will build a stone-cold storage warehouse. Not knowing what that means, he asks Lloyd. The royal family preserves food using ice magic. What they are going to do is similar, but they won't use magic. To make it, they will need a special stone called granite. It is a very resistant stone and will be difficult to extract. Normally, one would use dynamite to extract the stones, but right next to him is a human dynamo. From Javier's look, he already knows he will use him again. In one of the main episodes of the story, in the city of Namram, the entire population was trapped in a magic barrier, and within this city were thousands of refugees that Javier needed to save. At this moment, Javier was a sword master with 4 cores spinning around his mana heart. At this moment of despair, he unintentionally created a skill. The explosion from the collision was so strong that, aside from destroying the magic barrier, it became one of his main techniques. Lloyd explains this technique that he could use. Javier again asks how he knows about this, but the protagonist says he just thought of it at some point. Even though the real reason he taught him this technique was to use him, it would still be a great strength boost if he could execute it. Protecting the mana heart with 1 core and moving the other 3, he releases an explosion into the rock. It was so strong that it tore through all his clothes and even ruffled his hair. Angry, Javier asks if he knew that would happen, but Lloyd says he had no idea and apologizes. Anyway, the idea worked. Now it's his turn to work. Javier speaks of his knight's honor, and that now he's being used for construction, but the MC realizes that this is just his way of showing gratitude. After this, the construction proceeded rapidly. The granite Javier cut was carried by Padong. The orcs who were addicted to training started working on their own. Because of this help, they will be able to finish 5 times faster, and the last thing they will need is the ice and thermal insulation. Lloyd asks Javier where the people with the insulating material are. He replies that it's been exactly 3 weeks, and the group should have arrived by now. There are 2 possibilities. Either the soldiers are lazy, or there was an accident. The protagonist says they must check immediately. Javier stops him and says that if this is a mission, he should do it alone since he doesn't know what kind of accident happened. It could be dangerous. But Lloyd has explained this several times. He is in charge of construction and responsible for the workers' lives. Exploring further into the mountains, he ends up finding one of the gloves he had custom made to use when handling insulating materials. Javier warns that he senses a strange energy coming toward the canyon, an abnormal flow of mana but very faint. Thinking about it, he tries to remember if he saw something similar in any of the novel's episodes, but something leaves him completely terrified. He immediately says there's no time, and they need to walk quickly, as everyone might be dead. They venture further into the canyon, finding several clues from the missing group, until they reach Rupalan's dungeon. This was a place Javier had been looking for since the beginning of the novel, the hideout of a black mage named Rupalan. The protagonist is deeply irritated that someone dared to lay hands on his workers. Javier is the first to enter the cave, telling Lloyd to stay behind him. He ends up stepping into a trap but is narrowly saved by the protagonist. MC asks if he's sure he's a knight. He should have thought that there might be a trap inside. In fact, he already knew about the existence of this trap since in the novel, Javier fell into it and had to continue through the dungeon all battered. But Javier is the type of person who never falls for the same trick twice. Lloyd comments that earlier, he felt a normal mana flow and asks him to use that technique since magical traps are linked to mana. He would be able to sense any abnormalities. Javier manages to detect where the traps are located and begins to guide the way to the back of the cave. The swordsman thinks that even though his master always lies or insists on annoying things, this time it seems like he knows exactly what's going on. He can't sense any special mana or energy, and thinks it might be a type of very powerful mana, but he decides to ignore that and focus on rescuing the workers. Inside the cave, a black mage senses the presence of intruders since one of the traps was activated. They probably came to rescue the recently kidnapped people. However, the black mage has already finished the preparations he needed to make and approaches a large iron door. Opening it, the 5 missing workers are there. He grabs one of them by the hair and starts dragging him, throwing him into a magic circle of blood. This is the magic circle that connects to hell. Using a scythe bathed in blood for 100 days and a young human, he will execute his spell. Before he can hit him, the black mage hears a shout telling him to stop. At the entrance to the laboratory, he sees Lloyd and Javier ready to attack him. Surprised at how fast they got there since there were hundreds of traps in the cave, the mage automatically uses one of his spells. 2 iron doors close around them, trapping them in that small space. The protagonist already knows what's coming and holds his breath as a sleep-inducing gas starts to fill the area. Lloyd uses his ability that makes him tireless for 10 minutes and starts digging quickly into the ground to make a tunnel. He doesn't need to worry about Javier since he is already immune to all medications to treat his insomnia, so sleeping pills don't work on him. Seeing Lloyd digging a hole under the door, he looks like a giant mole. Javier will keep that memory to tease him later. When the MC finishes digging the hole, he calls Xavier to finish it, preparing a magical explosion to surprise the black mage. The big explosion works, and the black mage is totally shocked to see that. Observing the protagonist emerge from the hole in a monstrous way, he decides to summon a creature to fight. A 2-headed monster comes out of the circle. Even though it's one of his failures, this monster is still very strong. Seeing this giant creature in front of him, Lloyd tries to tell Javier its weak point, but using the explosive wave, he manages to make a cut that tears the monster in half. Even the MC is impressed, since he didn't know he could use the explosion as a propeller to cut. This is a technique that doesn't even exist in the novel. Seeing the swordsman easily deal with his monster, the black mage goes into despair, as he can't defeat them. The protagonist approaches him and asks how he intends to compensate for delaying the construction by 2 weeks due to the soldier's abduction. The black mage kneels, begging for forgiveness. In his mind, all he thinks about is surviving, but the protagonist doesn't care about the apology and asks about the compensation. With no alternatives, the black mage offers all his magical items. Lloyd is quite pleased that all the items will be his, while Javier rescues the soldiers. The MC asks what he was going to do with the kidnapped soldiers. The black mage was studying the resurrection of the dead, trying to bring back his deceased wife and son. He worked as a mage in the Lord's mansion, but one day the Lord tried to take them away from him, so the black mage planned to escape with his family. Lloyd interrupts his story right in the middle. He is not interested in hearing it at all. The protagonist asks if the black mage really thinks that bringing back his wife and daughter after killing hundreds of people will be good. Due to his selfish goal, he ruined several other happy families. He can only be judged as a serial killer after doing that. Lloyd says he will come back later to take the magical tools. While turning his back, he asks him never to hurt anyone again. The black mage is amazed by his kindness and thanks him several times for sparing his life. In the novel, Javier also forgives the black mage and forces him out of the laboratory. Repellent kills hundreds and transforms into something strange, becoming a demonic villain who fights Javier several times. Even knowing that he was beyond saving, Lloyd still turned his back because he knew from the beginning what he would try to do. Quickly, Javier finishes off the black mage who is ready to attack, removing his head from his body. Before becoming Lloyd, in his past life, he met a man who simply mistreated him for no reason, The supervisor acted like this every day, and the MC always apologized. Thinking that kindness begets kindness, he lowered his head, but precisely because of this, he chose him as an easy prey to be mistreated. One day his anger finally consumed him, and he couldn't stay calm anymore. That day the protagonist gave the beating that bastard deserved. While hitting him, all he could think was that he was screwed. But the result was completely different. The man started to fear him and avoid him. On that day, he realized that there are certain moments when violence needs to be stopped with violence. Villains must receive punishment equal to their crimes. Returning to the orc village, the protagonist notices that his men are very tired. Seeing that he could faint at any moment, Lloyd instructs him to hand over his backpack. The worker hesitates to comply, but Lloyd explains that if he faints, someone will have to carry both him and his backpack. In reality, the young master takes backpacks from all the workers, ties them together, and declares that if anyone complains from now on, they won't receive bonuses. Javier isn't sure if he's doing this just for the backpacks or for the soldiers as well, but the truth doesn't matter to them, since all the soldiers see Lloyd as a trustworthy leader they can follow. The system sends messages asking if he doesn't find this rewarding, but for the protagonist, his only reward is money, nothing more. Arriving at the orc village, the stone-cold storage is already complete. Inside, the young orc notes that it is indeed a bit colder than outside, but not enough to prevent the meat from spoiling. Lloyd says it's still not complete as they lack ice to cool the area. Hiroshi asks how he's going to get ice since their living area is very hot. With a smile, Lloyd says he'll get it one way or another, which makes the orc doubt him, thinking he brought a swindler to the village. However, the young Hulk decides to trust him, since his savior shouldn't be a bad person. When the orc leaves, Javier asks how he's going to make ice, but that's something even the protagonist doesn't know. Javier questions him signing the contract without a plan, but Lloyd explains that to be successful, you have to make the impossible happen. At night, the protagonist sits on rocks pondering how to make ice. First, he made molds and asked his pets to fill them with water, but he doesn't know how to turn it into ice. In this world, there are ice mages, but he doesn't know exactly how their magic works. He knows that magic is a way to control mana freely, a technique based on changing the arrangement of mana in the atmosphere. There are various types of different mana. If he can gather just one type and concentrate it, then he might have what is considered magic. Lloyd asks his pets to fill the giant ice cubes. Even though he can't use mana freely, he can do something similar. Placing his hand in the water and using the Azrahan core technique, he will try to draw only the warm mana and leave the cold in the water. In the first attempt, he does the opposite and pulls only the cold energy. Javier thought he was just being reckless, but apparently, the young master is finding his way proudly. A few days later, he actually succeeds. The orc chief and his son are shivering in the cooling room. What causes all this cold is a huge block of ice made from several smaller ones. Both of them are truly happy. Now they don't need to hunt every day or waste protein. Lloyd looks at Javier with a look that says, "This is the mind of an entrepreneur," and the swordsman agrees that he was indeed right. The orc lord says he is deeply indebted to Lloyd, who has now gained the 120 workers, mentions that he was merely following the contract. However, the chief states they don't take things for granted just because of a contract. Therefore, he and the entire Steel Sand tribe now declare Lloyd Frontera's family as blood brothers, and to celebrate, all the orcs strike the Arnold pose. All friends of the Frontera family will also be their friends, and all enemies will be considered enemies of the entire tribe. The protagonist, pleased, reciprocates by flexing his few muscles. After a week, when they arrived in the city, people's reaction was exactly what they expected. It's obvious they were scared to see 120 muscular orcs entering the city. Lloyd wonders if he should have made a formal announcement to calm the people. It seems even that wouldn't have worked since even his parents, who knew the orcs were coming, were scared. Besides the points the protagonist gained from the orc village, the story of how he saved the workers from the dark mage also spread, leaving him with a total of 911 points. The Baron said he would look for wealthy merchants to buy the orcs' equipment. Now all that's left is to figure out how to use the Dark Mage's tools. While looking through a book, Lloyd finds something so surprising that he immediately rushes to the mine. There, he searches for the defaulter everywhere and tells him he has great news. The clause in the contract stating he would work for 520 years was a joke, since it makes no sense for someone to live that long. But now he won't have to worry about it, as he found a spell that can turn someone's body into a ghost and control it. This means he will be able to work for the next 520 years. The protagonist asks why he's the only happy one there and tells him to smile. The defaulter forces a smile, while shedding tears of despair. His actions were so cruel that the system says the king of hell is enchanted by his personality. Returning to the mansion, there are things he needs to discuss personally with the Baron. He looks for him everywhere, but a maid says the Baron received a visit from loan sharks. At that moment, Lloyd's expression changes completely. He definitely has something planned for them. In the meeting room, the loan sharks are trying to convince the Baron to hand over the mine in exchange for paying only 10% of the initial debt. While he is silent, thinking about it, the protagonist knocks on the door asking to come in. This time, Lloyd arrives quite friendly to talk to them. They immediately show they have the contract, and that he won't be able to expel them from the house again. However, he continues with his act and humbly asks to make a suggestion. They refuse, but Lloyd keeps talking, leaving them quite irritated. Lloyd goes on and says that if he doesn't make suggestions, it will leave him a little irritated. At that moment, behind him, the young orc appears in fury, asking who made his brother irritated. The two loan sharks are terrified of the orc, but Lloyd tells him not to worry, as they will accept his suggestion. After the meeting, the two loan sharks run out of the mansion. Lloyd tells his father that he would like to make the debt disappear, but since that would be a crime, they must be content with this outcome. He also mentions that the extraction of bituminous coal is going very well. However, now they have another terrible problem to deal with. Orcs eat 10 times more than a normal person, and if they can't resolve this, they will end up with more debts. As he expected, the orcs are great miners. Some of them mine for over 24 hours without stopping and have to be forcibly removed by humans. Their productivity is 10 times better than he expected, and they also refuse to receive wages. Their payment is in food, but the cost of this food has increased so much that Lloyd considers raising taxes to meet this demand. However, continuously raising taxes would be theft, making the population dissatisfied and work less. The simple solution to this problem is for the population to earn more money, and for that, they will use the wasteland in the north of the village, turning a swamp into a farm. Obviously, this won't be easy. Even with knowledge from another world, the protagonist still struggles to create a perfect drainage system. After 21 days of effort and hard work, even Javier asks the Baron if he should stop Lloyd, as he's not sleeping or resting properly. But the chief says that he used to hate his son, as he was worthless. But now seeing all his effort to achieve something, the only thing he can do is respect and not get in his way. When night fell, Lloyd finally managed to create a perfect drainage system. Now tax money will flow like water. He lies on the ground extremely tired, but compared to the overtime and sleepless nights he used to endure, he can handle it. At this moment, a notification from the system appears in front of him, adding a new option to the design ability, allowing simulations using data obtained through measurement. Lloyd does a quick test, activating his ability on a distant mountain, and when he modifies the structure in an abnormal way, it breaks. He's angry that the system only mentioned this now, after a month of working like crazy. Arriving at the swamp, he starts the first phase of the wetland recovery project. The first step is to have his pets drink all the water from the land. The MC knows that just the two of them won't be able to do it, so he intends to use all his points to summon as many pets as possible. With his current number of RPs, he can summon 4 of them. The pets don't need to have special abilities. They just need to be big enough to drink all the water. The creature that comes out of the portal hits the protagonist's face due to its speed, and when it lands, Lloyd is surprised as it looks like a hippopotamus, an aquatic animal. The 3 pets celebrate by playing among themselves. The protagonist, now hopeful, asks him to show his instructions. Like all the others, Hippo spits out a card, and Lloyd, accustomed to this, picks up the card and reads it, discovering that it won't grow even if fed sunflower seeds. As Hippo doesn't grow like the others, it won't be suitable for this mission, so Lloyd decides to ignore it and summon another. His pets become irritated by his attitude and console their new friend. The protagonist tries to explain that he's not suitable for the job, but the pets go on strike, insisting he acknowledge their values. Lloyd decides to give it a chance and asks about its ability. The small hippo demonstrates the one gulp ability, which allows it to drink a lot of water in just one gulp, but it can only drink what its stomach can hold. Lloyd briefly thought this would be the best ability for the job, but is once again disappointed. Hippo decides to show what it can do and starts drinking water from the lake. The protagonist thinks he's hallucinating. As Hippo seems to be getting bigger, it begins to drink the entire lake, leaving Lloyd astonished by how much it has grown. In a few seconds, that immense swamp dries up. Hippo seems satisfied after drinking so much water, while the protagonist is completely shocked by how much he managed to drink in such a short time. The other two pets look at their master with a "I told you so" expression, while Lloyd asks the system if this is really random since he always gets the magical beasts he needs, but the system is vague and only says he's lucky. Hippo asks if it can keep drinking more. The reincarnated architect tells him to drink until he can't anymore, since the construction of the Matrix terrain will start tomorrow. The next day, the workers are amazed at Hippo's size. He's part of the first process, drinking the maximum amount of water and spitting it into the river, repeating this process several times until everything is dry. Then the workers remove the roots of the herbs and the rest of the plants in the soil. Using mana explosion, holes are made, and bamboo is placed while Padong compacts the soil to remove water from the deepest part of the ground. Hippo uses the bamboo as straws. Only after all this, using his simulation ability, they build a dam. With all these processes completed, they have just finished the first sector. Lloyd shouts that after they finish, they'll have a big celebration, cheering up all the workers. After a few days, even Javier is impressed that they turned that abandoned land into cultivated land, but he also wonders when a swordsman started working in construction so naturally. Lloyd arrives shouting his name. He asks Javier to spread seeds along the way to combat some insects. The great swordsman has been reduced to a farmer. Next time, he'll be sure to refuse these requests from the young master. At that moment, the Baron and Baroness arrive, seeing that wonderful scene, and everyone must be thinking the same thing they are. What they're witnessing is a miracle. The people of the village start to show respect for the protagonist, earning him even more RPs. Javier is also happy taking care of his plants, watering them as if they were his daughters. Lloyd says the only thing left to finish everything is the water wheel, a device to prevent the swamp from flooding again. They start to hear horse hooves approaching. An entire cavalry is heading towards them. Lloyd asks who those men are. Javier says that's Viscount Racona, who owns the northern part of the swamp. When they arrive, the protagonist identifies himself as responsible for the construction. One of the mounted subordinates says this is the Viscount's land, and they should leave immediately. The Mara's swamp is a place that hasn't been visited by anyone for hundreds of years. The northern part is land administered by Viscount Lacona, while the southern part is administered by the Frontera. However, they obviously claimed rights over the land out of nowhere, aiming to take this fertile land without any effort from the start. It makes sense for them to insist on handing over the land, since a part of the swamp is indeed their property. That much is clear until now. Lloyd asks the Viscount if he's really saying that his land was invaded. The man on horseback tries to speak but is interrupted by the protagonist, who says this conversation is among nobles. The man gets angry, while the farmers question the young master's actions. Lloyd introduces himself as the eldest son of the Frontera family. The Viscount comments that his behavior is indecent and asks to call Baron Frontera. The MC pretends not to have heard and scratches his ear. When questioned, he says the only thing he heard was the sound of a dung fly. The Viscount looks for the fly but is alerted by his guard that the young man is referring to him. Lloyd talks about the laws of the kingdom's lands, Law number 321, a special law about cultivating wasteland. If wasteland is abandoned for a long time, it's possible to establish ownership of the land. If left unattended for 100 years without residence or cultivation, it's considered land without an owner. To be recognized as property, the land must meet one of 4 requirements, and one of them is to have a harvest of at least one specific planting. At that moment, Javier remembers his conversation with Lloyd some time ago, where he mentioned that the seeds are to rid the land of pests. The protagonist congratulates the Viscount on witnessing the first harvest in the history of the Mara's swamp. Realizing that he had already prepared himself, the Viscount feels deceived. Lloyd kindly gives the cabbage as a gift to him and orders the cavalry to leave his territory, or else they would be considered trespassers. Seeing them all leave disappointed, Javier asks if he received a prophecy that these people were coming. In reality, this isn't the first time the protagonist has dealt with people trying to take advantage of others' efforts. All the farmers are also satisfied and celebrate that the young master managed to protect their lands. However, he continues to maintain his mercenary pose, only thinking about money, and tells everyone to get back to work. Late at night, the protagonist sits watching the crops being hit by a huge storm. With summer ending, autumn brings rain. Even though he has used simulation hundreds of times, he shouldn't let his guard down and observe until the end. By morning, the rain has passed, and with it, the worry. Thanks to his great invention, that land didn't turn back into a swamp, and he even gained achievement points from the system. Now that the first thing is done, he will move on to the next step. Meanwhile, in Viscount Lacona's territory, he might be indignant with the situation. If they continue planting for 2 years, the land will officially be theirs. The swamp is the land where golden eggs will hatch. Even his stomach is hurting from having to give up his precious land. He can't let this fertile land slip from his hands and asks his executive to call the dye workshop supervisor. A few days later, Lloyd wakes up from his bed with a severe headache. Perhaps the long days without sleep have finally caught up. Even so, he can't just lie in bed, as there's much to do. The problem arises when even Javier wakes up strangely. He's also experiencing the same headache, making the protagonist realize that this isn't just a coincidence, but something intentionally done by someone. It wasn't just the two of them who were affected. The maid Emily, Mr. Alap, the boy in charge of the cows, and the cows themselves were all affected. In summary, this is affecting everyone in the village, humans and animals alike. The animals with better instincts refuse to drink water, leading the protagonist to believe that the water must be causing this. Lloyd's greatest weapon in this world is his knowledge, but after the incident with the ants, he realized that not everything is as it seems. Expecting the Viscount to take action, research was done on his territory, revealing that his main source of income is dye technology using the Ladona fruit. The problem is that this fruit can be toxic to humans. Due to his envy and greed, Racona, without a doubt, sabotaged the village's water. Inside the mansion, Baron Frontera is shocked by a proposal. The Viscount's subordinate demands half of the wetlands, promising they would stop dumping dye waste into the water. The protagonist's father calls it blackmail, but that's exactly what he planned to do. Even if taken to court, it will take at least 2 years for a verdict, and with all the legal fees and the cost of new clean water, it will be very expensive for him. At that moment, Lloyd enters the room, telling his father that their parasitic neighbors are tampering with the water. The door slams in the subordinate's face, who complains to the protagonist for insulting his master. With a look of anger, the protagonist remarks that he didn't know trash parasites could understand humans. Humiliated again, the knight cannot contain his anger, drawing his sword and challenging him to a duel. Shortly after, we see the same scene again, with Lloyd beating someone who has already surrendered. After the person cries and begs for mercy, Lloyd pretends to be satisfied, only to beat him again shortly afterward. The Baron warns his son that the duel is over, but his expressions show he's quite pleased with what he's doing. After being beaten, the subordinate returns to his master, who calls him trash for being beaten by the incompetent son of the Baron. However, upon reflection, the subordinate did a good job because the Frontera can only take the case to court, and they can use this public beating to delay the process by 3 or 4 years. At least, that's what the protagonist thinks the Viscount is planning. However, as a Frontera, he will resolve this using his own methods, rallying the population to defend their lands from greed. First, to solve the water problem, they build a reservoir using hippo to bring water from a local river before it becomes polluted, filling the reservoir. Javier says it's a good solution, but they'll have to do it every day without rest. Lloyd says it's only a temporary solution. The real plan is to build a water supply system. To do this, infrastructure will have to be built to bring water from Lake Kapua in the eastern mountains, which will be a massive undertaking in terms of work and costs. However, the protagonist knows exactly how they will recover what was spent, multiplied by 100. Months later, the Viscount is extremely anxious about something. The manager informs him that the eldest son of Baron Frontera is requesting an audience to help solve recent problems. Inside the room, Lloyd sarcastically remarks that he's doing very well and is there to help with his problems. The Viscount tries to play dumb, saying he has no problems, but Lloyd insists he could save his dye workshop from bankruptcy. At that moment, the Viscount understands that the crisis he's facing is the fault of young Frontera. But before he says anything, Lloyd explains that due to the waste he dumped in the river, they had to bring water from Lake Kapua. Workers had to dig a long path of land, laying pipes for the water to pass through. In the middle of the route, they came across a huge valley, and their only alternative was to build a Roman-style aqueduct. For this, Javier had to blast a lot of limestone, as it's a material used in construction. Some limestone rocks ended up accidentally in the river. Anxiously, the Viscount asks, "What the hell does this have to do with your paint workshop?" Lloyd explains that the water flowing to the workshop is full of limestone, which caused their clothes to be dyed brown. Rakona says she will take them to court, and the protagonist says it will take at least 2 years, asking if anyone will remember their products during that time. Afraid of going bankrupt, the Viscount is totally shocked. Lloyd, having already satisfied him by dispelling his doubts, bids farewell. But as he's leaving, he's threatened by the Viscount, who says he'll make his life hell. Outside, Javier questions Lloyd's intentions. All he did was provoke him, but that man is truly dangerous due to his connections in the capital. The MC asks him to wait and see who has more to lose. A month later, the Viscount kneels to beg for help to save his paint workshop. With a tone of superiority, Lloyd asks if 2 of his prosperous connections said he couldn't win this case. Deeply regretful, the Viscount apologizes, but the protagonist isn't interested in pride or apologies. All he wants is for the Viscount to sign a contract. If he signs it, water will be supplied to his workshop in a week. Seeing the exorbitant amount he'll have to pay, he asks why someone would put a price on water. The protagonist finds it strange, as he was the one who taught him that water isn't free. Startled, the Viscount sees no alternative but to sign. Even his father is scared to receive such a large sum of money every month. With a cynical expression, he says the Viscount is a very generous man. Javier thinks that the Viscount started the battle. But now, the protagonist seems like the devil himself. That contract doesn't have a specific end date, which means he'll take everything from the Viscount until he dies. In fact, knowing Lloyd's personality, he'll be draining his money for generations. Like a demon king, Lloyd wouldn't let this slide with just a pat on the back. If he could exchange blood vessels for money, he'd rip them all out. The Count also has great news to share. He found a buyer for the Orc tribe's treasures. When the protagonist asks who bought them, he finds it really odd, as someone like him would easily be able to buy new pieces. His father doesn't know the details exactly, but it seems like he wants to build a statue in the sea. At that moment, we see Count Cremo looking out his window. On the horizon, something starts rising from the sea. A great monster emerges from the depths of the oceans. The Count looks at it angrily. The creature comes entirely out of the sea, ready to attack everything in its path.